Hello and welcome to PFI Talks, brought to you by Prague Finance Institute, an affiliate of the leading Czech economics research center Sergej EI. My name is Leos Rosek. I'm the head of communications at PPF Group and the host of this podcast. I'm pleased to welcome Kenneth Rogoff, a distinguished professor of economics at Harvard and the former IMF chief economist. Mr. Rogoff is an accomplished chess player and author of many books on economics. His latest, Our Dollar, Your Problem, is a sweeping history of the world's dominant currencies and where the dollar may be headed. Hello, Professor.
Greetings.
Well, since we are talking about your book, and let me just sort of do a little sort of product placement here, or reading placement. You talk about, in the initial part of the book, you talk about various different other than dollar currencies that have tried to become dominant currencies of global trade and everything. And for someone coming with an experience from the Soviet bloc, ex-Soviet bloc, like myself, I have to admit that, it was very interesting to read how you, as a chess player, were looking in the 70s, 80s, or maybe 60s even, were looking at the potential dominance of the so-called convertible ruble. Yes, of course, it was used for the for settling trades and within the Comecon countries, but you know, inside we were all sort of like laughing at it. That was just a sort of a fig leaf that everybody wanted a greenback. I'll just put it this way. So, was that fear like really based on something relevant at that time, or was it just a lack of data that were not really forthcoming from the Soviet Union when it comes to just basic statistics?
Well, first of all, as a teenager traveling around Eastern Europe, and I certainly interacted with a lot of Russians, I wasn't thinking about, boy, I want your currency. We swap dollars for rubles? No, I wasn't thinking about that. It was really only when I was an undergraduate at Yale, I missed a lot of my latter high school years, but then went to Yale, where I was reading in my introductory course. I took Russian economics, where there was quite a debate about that. So the most famous economist of the 20th century, one of the two or three most famous, Paul Samuelson, and his textbook, which was read by everybody, predicted that the dollar would, not that the ruble would catch up with the dollar, but that Russia was going to catch up as an economy with the United States. And exactly what shape the ruble would have taken, but it would have certainly had a big footprint in the global economy. So I think I was a freshman. It's embarrassing, I'm so old, but I was a freshman and taking this course in 1972. And he was predicting the catch up sometime between, I think, 87 and 94. You're just looking at extrapolation like people do today. But it wasn't just him. Oh, my goodness. There were a leading economist, Walter Rostow, was a superstar, one of the major players in development, predicted that. He was very influential with the several presidential administrations. And back then, when you were at Yale, the clever papers were not about why Russia worked so badly, but why it worked. I know it was. I know people who are younger. I even have a extremely bright, brilliant Russian colleague. I don't want to say more. Who says, "No, nobody could have ever thought that." Well, we did. We didn't have the data. I mean, there were people like Milton Friedman who were skeptical, and I was skeptical when I was being taught about this. But no, we didn't have the data. It's first of all, the Russian didn't make it easy to get. Second of all, if you're not a market economy where you can aggregate prices, that's how we measure income. You take the computers and you add the meat and steel and you add it all up at market prices to form what your GDP is. Well, they didn't have market prices, which left a lot of room for creative accounting. But it wasn't just that. I mean, visibly, Russia, put a man in space ahead of the United States. They were very good in physics and many other fields that a lot to the outside eye they had a lot of spectacular accomplishments. But yeah, yes, now it seems laughable. But when I was, when I was a teenager, watching my neighbor build a bomb shelter, it didn't seem laughable.
Well, but still, one of the underpinnings of dollar's current dominance is that it is a main currency for settling, crude oil trades. And the ruble, thanks to building now underused gas pipeline going to then West Germany, the Soviets became sort of very dominant players in the trades of hydrocarbons with Western Europe. Wasn't there a chance for them to elevate the convertible dollar to a sort of like a proper, at least regionally dominant currency?
I mean, by the time the Soviet Union fell, it became apparent that the whole economy was smoke and mirrors, and they were producing, as you say, hydrocarbons. Today, the Soviet economy is, I don't know, 15th the size of the United States. So this is sort of old history. I don't think anyone was thinking about it in the 1990s. But there was a time, people don't know. Had Russia adopted reforms like China did, and you're much more expert on this than I am, so I'm embarrassed to talk about it. But like the Kosygin-Brezhnev reforms that they tried had some flavor of what Xi Jinping, did in China. Had it made some things market and done a few sensible things, it would have done a lot better. And I don't know about a convertible ruble, but they would have. I don't know if it ever would have retreated from Eastern Europe. I don't know, how its footprint would have expanded in Africa and Asia. Look at China today. And Russia wasn't programmed to fail the way it did. It made some bad mistakes along the way.
Okay, we'll get back to renminbi a little later. But when it comes to the dominance of the dollar and its current status, given what's going on with the tariffs that we are sort of like going through and not really understanding, as that situation seems to be changing every day. I mean, isn't that a sort of a tipping point for? In your book, you described dollar as a correct me if I'm wrong, late Middle Age currency, given.
So my view, looking at a historical perspective post World War II, and also thinking about the economics underlying it, is that the dollar peaked maybe 10 years ago in terms of its global footprint. And just to think about that, Asia's 50% of the dollar block by the measure I use with Ethan Olszewski and Carmen Reinhart. It's not the only one, but I think it's a pretty good one about what countries are trying to stabilize their exchange rate around. I think that's a portmanteau measure of dollar dominance. Well, China sort of has been moving away from that since 2015. And as China moves away, it is the world that, the biggest exporter and importer for many, many countries. So others are moving away. So I don't think people should, when the currencies change, it doesn't happen overnight. It can happen over a couple of decades. It doesn't take a century, but it doesn't happen overnight. But another currency moves and, takes some of the space. I think the dollar, so my book views there being many weaknesses in the dollar at its peak, some of them coming from the rest of the world doesn't like it. The title of the book captures our arrogance about it, but also coming from the fact that we have a lot of internal problems. Even before Trump, there's a lot of pressures to undermine the Federal Reserve, pressures on protectionism, pressures on the rule of law coming from both sides. So I think that was going to lead to losing some of the footprint of the dollar. The renminbi, yes, but, if the euro ever you could ask me about this later, but if the euro ever became some kind of geopolitical force, Europe, which it isn't at the moment, the euro could expand also. So it's not that the dollar disappears, but it suddenly has less of a lead. That matters a lot okay, the obvious thing is it affects our interest rates. We get a lower interest rate for sure. Controlling for how much debt we issue, by the way. I mean, we issue the United States. I'm an American. We issue a ton of debt. And our interest rate on 10-year bonds actually really isn't lower than other countries now, controlling for, various ways of trying to hedge. But we have a ton of debt out. If we had Germany's debt level, our interest rates would be a lot lower. So if you take away some of the demand, and the tariffs are going to take away some of the demand, my Six Puzzles paper with Maury Obstfeld 25 years ago is all about that. Take away some of the demand, that pushes up interest rates. But it also affects our ability to see everything. If you are the uber dominant currency, if you're the uber dominant military power, you have a lot of control over the rules of the game. What are the rules of the IMF? How does SWIFT work? How does market clearing work? That's, I think, a thing very few people understand when they talk about dominant currency. They're just thinking about convenience. No, we make rules so that it favors us a lot. And we have a lot of control over that because both of the dominance of the dollar and the military dominance. And China is going to move some of that away. It's not going to happen overnight. And Europe is going to move some of that away. So I think we've seen the peak and we're in decline just on the footprint of the dollar. And then there are further issues. I won't, I'll go back to you. There's much more to say about it.
Well, of course, I mean, it's we can go on about that. And it's true that especially for Europe, the realization of what the dominance of dollar brings came when sanctions were actually weaponized, when the currency reserves were weaponized after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Although there were, as you mentioned, there are some other nations around the world who have not been happy with the dollar's dominance because they faced sanctions for other reasons elsewhere. Just, an example of Iran, for example, and everything. But
well, the Europeans were quite upset about Iran when we put sanctions on Iran, and the Europeans didn't agree with it. And, back 10 years ago, and we bullied the Europeans into going along with it. We said, okay, if you play with Iran, you can't use our financial system. But there are other ways everyone's very unhappy. The sharing of information. Donald Trump can see more than you can possibly imagine if he wants to about, a gift you bought, for somebody. Just the incredible information. I would say a significant part of our spying comes through our financial dominance and able to see all the transactions. There are many dimensions to dollar dominance. And believe me, the Europeans are well aware of this. I had the head of one of the major central banks come into my office at Harvard once, and I want to say 10 years ago, 8 years ago, and they were very upset that they had just bought something for their spouse. And it was a transaction between two European countries, but somehow crossed the dollar. And he realized and knows all about this, that Donald Trump was president. He could see the transaction. And that just made him so mad. And so it's much deeper than that. And especially if you don't trust us. And why should you?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a great segue to what I raised in the intro, and it's the title of the book. Because it's actually pretty amazing when I read that this book was forthcoming, and then I saw the title, I was like, oh, what a great title. And then you actually downplay because you immediately at the very intro, and I'm not actually it's not a showstopper of me saying that, because you are very open about it at the very beginning, that it is not your statement, that it's actually it's something that John Connolly, a U.S. politician, said, but when he became the Secretary of State. But can you tell us a little more about the story of the title, and maybe a little about John Connolly? I'd like to let you sort of retell your book.
Yeah, I mean, John Connolly was a Texan, very colorful character. He'd been governor of Texas. He was actually in the car with John F. Kennedy the day he was shot, and he was badly injured on that day. He recovered, and almost 10 years later had become Nixon's. He was the president from 68 through the early 70s. He was Nixon's Treasury Secretary. And Nixon, what our exchange rate system was back then, and I think even many of your finance students really wouldn't know this. The dollar used to be good as gold. You used to be able to trade the dollar for gold if you were a government. So people couldn't after the early 1930s. The Franklin Roosevelt got rid of that. But governments could. The whole system was built around that. Your Germany or France, your Germany, your France, you would stabilize your currency to the dollar, and you held a lot of dollar treasury bills, not cash, to do that. And, it had its problems, but let's face it, Europe grew like gangbusters during that period. It was a successful period. But the US decided to expand our social programs, invade, have the Vietnam War, many other things. And we were starting to get inflation. And if you want to fix your currency to gold and have inflation, it's not consistent because gold's not inflating. So Nixon at some point said, sorry, everyone, forget it. You can't trade your dollars for gold. And everyone, not just the Europeans, Canadians, Japanese, everybody were just, apoplectic about it. So he sent John Connolly there, and they said, well, what are we supposed to do? And he said, it's our dollar, it's your problem. And what's I like about the title, I've always felt Americans are incredibly arrogant. And so I like to point to that. I disagree with some of our policies expressing our arrogance. We'll come to that. But also, the inflation was a disaster for the United States. It was our problem. There's an irony in it. And it is at the beginning of the book, but if you notice, I come back to it at the end of the book when I find out just as I'm putting the, last touches, the last day on the page proofs. Oh my gosh, Donald Trump's been elected. And what a great title, because it expresses the same arrogance and irony that, I think a lot of things he's doing are going to be our problem.
But also, that's what's amazing about your book, that at first it may seem like, oh my God, this is just another economics book about, the role of currencies, exchange rate systems and everything else. But because you've been present at many of these meetings or you saw it through the prism of the IMF, you bring very personal touch to all this. And at the end of the day, currencies and money are personal because it actually touches all of us in many ways. And there was an interesting anecdote when you mentioned when there was this sort of fear in the U.S. about Japanese yen and Japan becoming and briefly it did become the world's largest economy for a certain period of time. It overtook by GDP measures in the purchasing power parity.
Per capita.
It overtook, GDP.
Yeah.
Sorry. And so there was this push of like, okay, you guys are, doing you've enjoyed this very weak yen, relative to dollar. You should actually make your currency appreciate. And it was sort of like you say that they were bullied at some meeting that the Japanese representatives of but at the same time there was this undertone, and correct me if I was reading too much in between the lines, that the Americans at that meeting actually didn't really know whether they could actually achieve that. They didn't know. They were not sure that the Japanese could do what they were asked to do. And then everyone was shocked that they actually did manage to strengthen the yen incredibly quickly, relatively speaking.
Yeah, that's a very important event in global economics, and
Plaza
obviously
Accords, yeah.
The Plaza Accord, and very important to thinking about some of the things Donald Trump is thinking about today. So the Plaza Accord happened in the mid 80s, and Japan was just killing it. The economy was, they had half the population of the US, but so what? I mean, the Netherlands was small when it was the dominant currency. The UK is just a little island with a quarter of the population of France and, ruled the world. So of course, Japan, could have emerged. And the US was trying to figure out what to do. And we tried various things, putting on, they had them do voluntary controls on their exports. And finally, the Reagan administration decided, no, they're just too cheap. We can't compete with them. We've got to make their currency higher. And so this was another Texan, was the Treasury Secretary then, Howard Baker. He was also quite a character. I mentioned that, again, the U.S. was starting to print a lot of dollars, and the Europeans were concerned. And I think they're, at a meeting one of my former MIT classmates attended, reputedly, one of the finance ministers, maybe the Netherlands, said to Baker, "If you don't change your policies, we're going to stop holding dollars." And Baker supposedly looked at him and said, I grew up in Texas, and my daddy taught me, if you pull a gun on somebody, you better be prepared to shoot. And, he was quite a powerful character. So I met him, a few years later, afterwards, and got a chance to speak to him one-on-one after he gave a talk at Princeton. And I said, you wouldn't know this. I was a pawn in this, but I actually worked on the Plaza Accord background stuff when I was at the Fed. And we were trying to ask ourselves, can currencies really be moved around through intervention? Is it really possible? How is it possible? So we released a book. I have a paper, back then. And I said, I won't say we said they couldn't do it, but we had our doubts. And he said, yeah, we weren't sure either what they were going to do. But the Japanese finance minister said to me, I can't make this decision myself. And he mentioned they always have to do things by consensus in Japan. I'm just using his words. So he had to, fly back to Tokyo. And 2 weeks later, they got the message, we're going to make it happen. And they did. And Baker told me they hit the nail on the head. Jean-Claude Trichet, the former head of the European Central Bank, showed me actually the whole agreement, the numbers they picked. They picked that they would make their currency stronger by 10%. It doubled. It didn't just increase by 10%. So Baker was, almost beside himself laughing when he's telling me about this, saying, yeah, they could do it. But, once the cat got out of the bag, they didn't know how to control it. And so the yen appreciated. And I try to pick some things in the book where I feel like I was wrong. And this is one of these episodes where I talk about that. The Chinese talk about this all the time. You are not going to do this to us. We are not going to let you bully us. And that's playing out before our eyes. And my initial reaction to that was, well, yeah, Japan did have a crisis, but it was like 6 years later, 5 years later, and in between, it boomed. It grew. Its stock market tripled, I think, in yen terms by a factor of 5 in dollar terms. Housing even more. It was the all-time boom time of all times. But I think as I reflected on it, really over the years and in writing the book, I realized that we bullied them into doing something they weren't ready to do. They didn't have the regulatory infrastructure. When they let all that capital flow in, which is really what they did, they built up a problem very similar to what we did in 2008, 2009. So, and I to just say, well, it didn't happen right away was missing the whole point. These things take time. So it's a fascinating episode. And I, needless to say, tell a lot more about it in the book.
Yeah, and there's one, consequence of the the strength of yen strengthening at the time is why, yes, as you said, initially there was this attempt to restrict imports of Japanese cars, but what happened? The Japanese started making cars in the US, and now, as an aggregate, they seem to be, maybe I don't have the latest figures in front of me, but they seem to be the biggest car maker. If you combine all the brands,
of auto workers,
and everything, and if I remember when was that? It was in the 80s. Donald Trump actually wrote an op-ed, sort of like complaining about the Japanese and the dominance. I don't remember now exactly what it was, before Plaza Accord or after, but that's not actually really important. But isn't he really trying to sort of like replicate this, sort of like bring the manufacturing from China to the US? And is it actually really replicable under the current circumstances with like what has happened to the U.S. economy since then, and given the Chinese opposition to actually appreciate renminbi?
I mean, the idea that you can become a much more closed economy without losing wealth vastly is just nonsense. I mean, you can't turn it back. I will say, there are complex national security issues that need to be thought about. For example, the Chinese dominate in shipbuilding. They produce half the world's ships, and we're not even second or third. And when we want to go build military ships, aircraft carriers, whatever, that's a big problem because there's a big symbiosis between military and civilian things. There are many in medicines. We'd like to produce more chips. They're a good argument. But it's not an argument for having French wine get taxed and Canadian lumber. So no, I don't know any economist who can explain his vision of wanting to go back to this world. What he misses, I mean, there are many things he misses, but I think what everybody misses is that you don't get dollar dominance at the other end of this. You inevitably get a shrinking of the footprint of the dollar. If we have a lot of tariffs making it expensive to get money in and out of the country, assuming countervailing tariffs, you don't invest as much. I mean, again, I go back to my 6 puzzles paper for those academics of you in 2001 with Obsfeld. You don't integrate as much financially. Well, we may not have been killing it in manufacturing, but we were in global finance. We were in tech. We were in farming. So the idea you can sort of cherry pick, well, I'm going to close things off to your manufacturing, but just keep doing everything else you're doing, or I'll take away your nuclear umbrella. That is just dumb. I mean, it's not going to work out in the long run. So I'm not talking about the next week, next month, but I feel that process, which was ongoing anyway. It's not something Donald Trump created. He's an accelerant. Is probably going to happen a lot faster now. But trying to tell what his vision is of things, I heard him say recently, what kind of a negotiator I am. What's mine is mine, and what's yours we'll talk about. That's what he says. Well, the U.S. is doing very, very well in so many other areas. You think you're going to preserve all of that when you undercut our open trading system, which is at the heart of it. Anyway, I sound like a broken record. I'm sure you hear from many economists, but I think we'll see a lot of hard data behind this. If not in coming months, I mean, I think for years to come.
Would you sort of agree with the description of what's going on, under the new presidency of Donald Trump in the U.S., that this is a sort of like the U.S. is in its Brexit moment, and sort of like, okay, we are decoupling ourselves from some sort of a, association, let's call it global trade as we've known it, and and now it's going to bring us the benefits. And we know how long the Brits have waited for the benefits of Brexit to materialize, and maybe someone actually, I remember reading somewhere, someone made a comment that the only benefit so far is the relatively low tariff, so imposed on the UK by President Trump.
Well, this is much bigger than Brexit. The US is much bigger, and UK wasn't putting 50, 80% tariffs on everybody or its major trading partners when it's doing it. I don't know where things are going to end up. I want to mention one of the things in the book I weave in a lot is chess. I think about chess all the time, but keep it out of my economics work. But I've decided in this book, every once in a while, throw in something I'm thinking. And, there's a phrase that the great Danish grandmaster Ben Larsen, he was number 2 in the world. I played him a couple times when I was 15 and maybe a little older, a few times actually. And he had this saying, somebody asked him once, would you rather be good or lucky? And he said, I'd rather be good and lucky. And I think Americans don't understand how lucky they've been that, if you go through everything that's happened, I'm not saying the dollar might not have come out on top, but if you look at how much it came out on top, there was a lot of luck. And I fear our luck has run out.
And was that the reason why you decided to write this book?
Well, I think
as a sort of a warning sign that, appreciate how lucky you've been, fellow American.
I mean, the honest answer to that is that took a lot of deep thinking over the period I was writing it and reviewing the history and putting it all together, came to that conclusion. I think what drove me to write about the book probably more than anything was my feeling that economists have this and financial analysts and the media have this tendency to extrapolate very short run trends and think that they're going to go on forever. And I had felt I had identified a number of dubious ones that had been the focus. I've been writing professional articles about this. So one is interest rates will be low forever. One is China will grow, to the clouds. And another was the dollar's forever. It's just a given. I'm amazed how many people still say that. They don't understand that you get to these turning points. We started with the Soviet Union. I didn't know the Soviet Union would fall. I had no idea. When that happened, I was very surprised. I mean, maybe not by the day, there were a few warning signs, but it was just shocking. The idea that nothing could ever change, things will always be the way it is. So what I do in my work, and also it's a big theme in the book, is look at really long time periods. Don't just look at the last 20 years, the last 30 years. And by the way, the typical American Economic Review paper does that. You're missing everything. Yeah, you're good at extrapolating a little trend and you'll get it right, but you miss the big kahuna. Forgive me for using a surfing phrase, not that I surf. I think it's very important to think about that. So I think that's what motivated me, really. I felt, and it's somehow hard to get anybody to listen to you because you're saying something different than people want to hear. So the real interest rates is an example where I've been debating that for 15 years, saying interest rates were low, but if you look historically, they weren't always. Why would you think, as Larry Summers, Paul Krugman, Olivier Blanchard, and not to mention many finance ministers, politicians, they're just going to keep going down? That's relevant to investors. It's very relevant to public debt. And so I've long argued that. And the durability of the dollar is not going to go away overnight. If you look at long history, they don't go away overnight. But you can lose some of your dominance. And when you do, you can lose a lot of your advantage.
Yeah, that's true, because there's also a, sort of a school of thought now that, from like the very investor's perspective, the traditional 60-40 portfolio is actually not really working now, because of course you have swings and now a downturn in the stocks, and your bond portfolio is not making up for some of that loss. So we are maybe really facing some sort of a little bit of a regime change or regime adjustments on the part of investors?
Well, on that topic, I have long thought that international diversification was good. And that has seemed like the dumbest idea until maybe it's not. Those ideas just, you can't invest enough in America. That was the theme at the World Economic Forum in Davos this year, American exceptionalism. And I was saying, if you're asking me what we're going to be talking about next year, it's why that was wrong. And I didn't know it would happen so fast. But I think there's a case for diversification. Actually, there's a joke in China. I don't know if your listeners know what A shares are, but in China, we Westerners can hold B shares, which are Hong Kong. The Chinese hold A shares. A shares have boomed.
Yeah.
And the joke in China is Trump's making A shares great again.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. I remember reading or seeing some meme about that. Now I understand. The meme, yeah. Moving to what could be next, because you touch on that in the book. It's like you do say that, the length of any currency's dominance is about 150 years, roughly speaking. So a century and a half. What could come after dollar? Could it be some sort of a global currency? Could it be some basket currency? Could it be crypto?
So I spent a lot of time on this in the book, needless to say, and I don't know, since I want to try to explain the whole answer. In our, in my lifetime, the dollar will always be there, but I think it'll be less. And yes, there'll be other things. I don't think it will be crypto, but I think crypto does compete for the world underground economy, which is another favorite topic of mine. Probably 20, even 25% of global GDP is stuff the authorities don't see. Why don't they see it? Well, some of it's drug trafficking, illicit activity, but a lot of it's tax evasion. And I talk about that. I have papers on this, and crypto can compete there. The regulators don't have the same, reach, and that's something that's important. But I think what I actually have more conviction about near term is a world of explaining why there's a world of much more volatility. So I mentioned earlier in this talk, our discussion, that I thought we reached peak dollar actually 10 years ago. It's not now. But I have another phrase I introduced, which is PAX dollar, PAX, not POX, PAX, which is it's on the whole, been pretty stable in global financial markets. They may not feel that way with the pandemic and the global financial crisis, but you compare it to other eras, not so bad. One of the sources of stability is low inflation. And the dollar being stable. And I have a Brookings paper with a few great co-authors from earlier a year ago, I guess, talking about why that's nonsense. We lived in the special globalization era where it was easy for central banks to be independent, but the political economy is going to come back with a vengeance. I find I'm really getting a little far afield, but forgive me. I think I wrote the first paper on why you should have an independent central bank back 45 years ago. The first theoretical paper demonstrating why it would be a good idea back when no one had it. And I think people, most central banks, I'd say over the last 25 years now, most countries do, and people just take it for granted. Been there for 20 years, 25 years, it will always be independent. That is just nonsense. And that's something I talk about the reasons for. So I think there are reasons that we might live in a more unstable world. I relay. I won't say it here, but relay an episode where I'm doing a panel with Jerome Powell, and it gets broken up by climate protesters, and but it's very much part of the problem of undermining central bank independence.
At the very beginning of our talk, you did mention a lot of upsides to having a dominant currency as your currency, as the Americans, as the U.S. is in dollar. So we talk a lot about pros, but there are lots of cons. Isn't it just losing the pros, or are there any other sort of disadvantages to being, having the dominant currency, other than losing the advantages?
Yeah, I mean, so one point that I write about is you have to be one of the couple dominant military powers. The idea, and a whole bunch of authors wrote about this, brilliant economists, but Barry Eichengreen at Berkeley, a Nobel class economic historian, Jeff Frankel, one of the top international economists, many, many others, predicted 15 years ago that we would go to a situation where there was a euro block, a dollar block, and an RMB block, which is we may go to, but we didn't. And what was so naive about this is you don't get to have a currency used outside your area if you don't project military force. And again, I said this before, it's not just crude that I'm going to enforce the contracts, that I'm going to bully you into repaying me. No, that's not it. It's that it gives you influence over the rules of the game. And so Europe, that may change now. Europe, wasn't able to do that. But that's expensive. Now, you want to have somebody providing a military force anyway. So I don't want to call the whole cost of that as being having a reserve currency, but you have to bear it. If you're Europe, they have to do it anyway now because, frankly, I think if Harris had won, she was the other candidate. Just for a few of your listeners who might not know, forgotten in the 2024 election. Had she won, it would have been the same story for it because she wanted to keep cutting the defense budget. Our defense budget is, like a third of what it was when the Cold War ended at the end of the 1980s as a share of GDP. We can't defend the South China Sea, intervene in the Middle East, in Ukraine. Forget it. And she would have done that much more aggressively. It would have been maybe a more pleasant conversation than we're having. But yeah, I mean that's something that probably was coming anyway. So that's a cost. But there are other very subtle costs. And being a podcast, but economists write a lot about, well, you have to be prepared to take it on the chin in a recession. And the obvious point about that would be that the dollar, in a panic, the dollar goes up. But when we're in a recession, I'm sorry. It is true that in a recession the dollar goes up, but we're losing money in our investments in the rest of the world. I'm twisting on my own ideas. So actually, when there's a recession, the U.S. gets capital losses on its holdings in the rest of the world, not even counting the stocks dropping. So there's a bunch of papers. My former student and a brilliant young economist I mentioned in the book, Tarek Hassan, has written about this. Many, many others. Elaine Ray and Pierre-Olivier Garenchas also talk about this. It's a little bit debatable how big the cost is, but that's also a cost of having a dominant currency.
When it comes to these blocks, we would actually end up going into yet another big discussion. And there's also this argument that having a strong economic bloc, let's say Chinese bloc, European, US bloc, one of the underpinnings of that, besides military, which Europe definitely lacks, is obviously access to labor and energy. And one of the dollar's advantages was that, U.S. doesn't even have to produce crude or gas, hydrocarbons, but it does, and it's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, producer at the moment as we speak. But it sets the price of hydrocarbons, hence petrodollar. Would that be at sort of another tipping point if like a lot more crude is traded in renminbi or other currencies?
No, absolutely. So commodities are traded in dollars, and mostly, it's actually probably about 80% in dollars. It's not 100%. But the Chinese are moving to change that. They're one of the big consumers, and they probably will be successful. It's not a terribly big deal at some level because commodity prices are so flexible that what you price them in, it's a little bit like I go to buy something in the store, and am I paying with Visa or MasterCard? It doesn't matter that much. But it's certainly another measure of the dollar dominance. But I think you hit the nail on the head with the core point is the U.S. has just incredible economic advantages. We are actually probably at the moment the world's biggest oil producer and way up there in other things. And that makes us more independent. We have incredible farmland. We have incredible ability to absorb immigrants, both in terms of land. I mean, Japan doesn't. They don't have land. And also a culture, although which is more accepting of immigrants. I know it's not very attractive right now, but I think there's no question that if you come to the United States, after a very short period, you feel like you're treated like just everybody else. And that's just not true. I know that from living abroad so much. I gained a lot from doing that as a teenager. But even in British society, I mean, I speak English. It was difficult to integrate. I was a teenager, but I don't think that was the whole thing. Whereas in the United States, it happens very quickly. So we have a lot of great advantages, but you can throw them out the window.
Says Kenneth Rogoff. Thank you for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you.
And to all our listeners and viewers, thank you for tuning in. See you next time.